DLC is one of those things that's a constant source of controversy in today's video game community, and I have very little doubt that Mass Effect Andromeda will be any exception to this. So this video is here to give some sort of insight into what Mass Effect Andromeda's DLC model will look like, based on prior DLC releases from BioWare. Before I get into this though, just note that there hasn't been any news or information surrounding DLC in Mass Effect Andromeda, but since BioWare seems to be becoming increasingly willing to cut out final release content, or content that perhaps should be in final release in favour of driving DLC, I imagine we'll be seeing pretty identical models here. So without further ado, here is a complete history of DLC in the Mass Effect and Dragon Age franchise, in particular the ones which in my opinion have no place being DLC or even outside of the base game. So let's begin with Mass Effect 1. Mass Effect 1 was released on November 7th, 2007, a day which is now celebrated annually as N7 Day. It's also notably about a month after EA announced its acquisition of BioWare. Mass Effect 1 had just two DLC packs, Pinnacle Station and Bring Down the Sky. Pinnacle Station had no bearing on lore or character development at all, and Bring Down the Sky has very minor effects on later gameplay, and also introduces the Batarian faction to the franchise. What this basically means is that the game that was released on November 7th was the game in its entirety, which is a really good thing in my opinion. Unfortunately, Mass Effect 1 seemed to be the last game that this actually happened in, and coincidentally this is the only BioWare game in both franchises which is written and developed before EA's acquisition. So let's move on to Dragon Age Origins. Dragon Age Origins was released almost exactly 2 years after Mass Effect 1, with 18 promotional DLCs from pre-orders, buying specific versions of the game or physical products from third-party retailers, and 10 gameplay DLCs which were released over its lifespan. Now, the majority of these DLCs were either cosmetic or exclusive weapons or items, though there was two that stood out to me as being pretty critical to the core game. The first of which being the Stone Prisoner DLC. This DLC was a character pack and was released on day one, and it contains the character Shale. Now, if you've played Dragon Age Origins, you'd know that Shale is a pretty integral character to the game, particularly to one very key section of the game. It's one of those things where she was such an important character, it would be odd to do a playthrough without her. So there's that. The second DLC, which was pretty core to me, was Witch Hunt. This DLC was the last one in Dragon Age Origins, and it was particularly critical if you had romanced Morrigan earlier on in the game, and it does contain some lore and perspective of her character which you simply can't obtain without it. Witch Hunt also introduced the Alluvians, which is a piece of lore which would later have a significant amount of importance in later games. All in all, not a bad DLC model in my opinion, especially since the Stone Prisoner is now free with every copy of Dragon Age Origins, and you do get Witch Hunt with the Ultimate Edition too. About 3 months after Dragon Age Origins, we get Mass Effect 2. This game launches with 10 promotional items and 15 gameplay DLCs released over its development lifespan. This again is mostly miscellaneous in-game items, but it does include 2 character packs and 3 major expansions, Overlord, Lair of the Shadow Broker, and Arrival. The 2 characters, Kasumi and Zaid, are really extras if I'm completely honest with you. I've played Mass Effect 2 with and without them, and it didn't really make that much of a difference in my core experience. The 3 expansion packs, however, did make a pretty significant impact on the overall gameplay, at least for me. Now, Overlord is kind of take it or leave it, but you do get a pretty interesting perspective which you could argue makes a good transition of Cerberus from morally questionable faction in Mass Effect 2 to explicit all-out enemy in Mass Effect 3. Arrival is a lot more important when it comes to lore though, and I really think that this should have just been a prologue to Mass Effect 3. It makes the imminent Reaper threat a terrifying reality, and it sets the scene for a full-scale invasion that we immediately get thrown into at the start of Mass Effect 3. It's the bridge between the 2 games, and without it, it just seems like something's missing between them. Finally though, in my opinion, the most critical piece of DLC is Lair of the Shadow Broker. If you even give the slightest damn about Liara as a character, then this DLC is a must-buy. If Liara is a romance in Mass Effect 1 for you, or if you plan to romance her in Mass Effect 3, then it's absolutely mandatory. It's a fantastic fleshed out DLC in itself, but without it in your playthrough, it's almost like BioWare just forgot that Liara exists in Mass Effect 2. She's a totally different character in Mass Effect 3 compared to Mass Effect 1, and without this DLC to really explain that transition, you're missing out on a massive amount of character development and perspective of arguably one of the most important characters in the franchise. Dragon Age 2 was released just over a year after Mass Effect 2, along with 25 pieces of promotional DLC and 10 add-ons over the game's lifespan. Dragon Age 2 has just one DLC which I think should have been in the main game, and that is the Legacy DLC. The Legacy expansion pack was important for two reasons. It provides a huge amount of character development for Hawke, and it gives insight into his or her previously unknown family lineage. But the most important reason is that the entire plot for Dragon Age Inquisition directly follows on from this piece of DLC. Yeah, you heard that right. The entire storyline for Dragon Age Inquisition is developed from this single piece of DLC. So, what exactly are you missing out on if you never got Legacy or just never played it? Well, for starters, it allows Corypheus to be more than just some crazy malnourished wannabe god who just turns up to ruin everyone's day, and there's absolutely no reasonable explanation as to why Hawke would show up in Inquisition either. I mean, without Legacy, Hawke has absolutely no connection to Corypheus, but Varric and Hawke will still talk about their battle with him and how they killed him. Essentially, the game will treat you like you played Legacy, even if you've never even heard of it. Now, all the gaps that are left from not having Legacy do get filled eventually in Dragon Age Inquisition, but it's not really the same as experiencing it all firsthand, in the same way as watching a Let's Play doesn't really give you the same experience as playing a game for yourself. Overall, this is a really critical piece of DLC, and there is no reason why this should have been left out of the main game. Trust me though, this DLC model of EA and BioWare's was about to get a lot worse. So, in March of 2012, Mass Effect 3 was launched. There was 12 pieces of promotional DLC at launch and 9 add-ons over the game's lifespan, but oh boy, was this game written with DLC in mind. BioWare went actually as far to cut out one of the game's core characters and sell him back to us on day one for £8. And by this, I don't mean remotely figuratively, I mean they quite literally wrote the story with this character included and then cut him out of the finished game to be resold as DLC. According to the script leaks of 2011, this character had a significantly more important role than he already does, which is pretty significant to begin with, which leads me to believe that the story was actually rewritten just so they could cut the character out and add it back as DLC instead. The potential for character development here and the insight into the lore is unprecedented as well. You have the sole surviving member of a civilization that was wiped out 50,000 years ago, waking up at the point in time where the same war is being fought in a different era against different species. I find it incredibly scummy that a character that has this much potential has just been literally cut out and tacked back on as DLC. And the whole game's just like this. I mean, you have Aria, who played a significant supporting role in Mass Effect 2 on Omega, and she's barely even mentioned in Mass Effect 3 unless you have the Omega DLC. And then you have Leviathan, which has a large chunk of lore and gives more of an explanation to the ending, which, as you're probably aware, was a big source of a lot of controversy. And then finally you have Citadel, which provides a massive amount of character development for your squad mates, and really is a must-have for anyone who's even remotely invested in Mass Effect itself. So, for Mass Effect 3, I really have to say that you need almost all of these DLCs to get the full experience of the game, which to me is just disappointing. As I said, it just feels like the entire game was almost written with selling DLC in mind. Moving on. On November 18th, 2014, Dragon Age Inquisition was released. Compared to previous BioWare titles, Dragon Age Inquisition had a remarkably small amount of DLC, though I imagine this is probably due to the fact that the developers' support of this game lasted just 46 weeks. There was 5 DLCs, with 2 of them being item packs, which in my opinion is a very good step in the right direction as far as models go. Jaws of Hakon and The Descent were the 2 expansions, and they were largely take it or leave it, and in my opinion, that's exactly how I would like DLC to be made. Good fleshed out content with its own storyline, but ultimately has little to no bearing on the main storyline itself. However, the 3rd and final DLC, Trespasser, is pretty much regarded as the 3rd act of the game. My worry here is that the events of this DLC will have some pretty important consequences in the sequel Dragon Age title, and we'll have a situation like the Legacy DLC was to this game. Without spoiling anything, the main game ends on a huge cliffhanger following a pretty mediocre boss fight. It's pretty underwhelming to say the least. In my mind, it's not actually an ending at all, and it leaves the player with a lot of unanswered questions, and guess what? These questions are somewhat answered in Trespasser. It's advertised and regarded as an epilogue DLC, but to me it feels like once again Dragon Age Inquisition's main storyline ended in the manner that it did in order to push sales of this particular DLC further along the line. So anyway, that's all I have to say about games themselves. Now, the only thing worse than how integral the DLC is to enjoying a BioWare game to its full is the fact that it never goes on sale. Seriously, the core DLCs for Mass Effect 2 and 3 that I've listed here in this video combined costs almost 12 times more than the entire trilogy itself. You have to buy BioWare points to buy this DLC as well, which guess what, you can only buy in packs of 800 or 1600 on Origin. So let's say you want to buy the Citadel DLC for Mass Effect 3 and the Overlord DLC for Mass Effect 2. These cost 1,200 points and 560 points respectively, and the total is £17.60 worth of points. But you can't buy £17.60 worth of points, you have to buy £24 worth of points, which, by the way, have absolutely no other use other than to buy BioWare DLC. Thankfully though, this system died after Mass Effect 3, so hopefully this will never be an issue again. And Dragon Age Inquisition even had a Game of the Year edition, which had all of its main DLC packs bundled with it. But the fact that the BioWare points model ever existed to me just goes to show how far EA and BioWare are prepared to go to make you part with as much money as they are legally able to. Just to summarise, the total cost of all the DLC for these 6 games that I've discussed today is £203, or $285 for you American folks watching this. The base games for the entire Mass Effect trilogy and all of the Dragon Age games cost just £17 at its historical lowest price, or $24 combined. Something to think about. Anyway, thanks for watching, goodbye.